for your patience as we get everybody connected here.
Go for it.
Great, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to Navigating Through a Pandemic, the CARES Act and its effects on retirement and investment plans. We hope that you, your families, and your practices are healthy and well. My name is Stephanie Lorette, and I will be guiding us through the presentation today. BuildRight and CPA Solutions have teamed up to provide healthcare practices with important details that will help you protect your businesses during this unprecedented time. We continue to receive new information daily, and understanding that is not only difficult to navigate the daily updates, but to also unpack all of the details. We wanted to present you with a way to navigate all of those changes through a series of webinars. And if you've been able to join us, we've gone through some different things ranging from PPP to paying your loan back, and we'll continue to do that over the next several weeks, so stay tuned for some additional dates on those. But today you'll hear from two speakers. We have Serena Morris, CPC QPA QKA from Carpenter Morris Group, and we have Frank Garcia with Resource Consulting Group, and they'll be guiding us through how the CARES Act affects your retirement investment plans. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce you to the President and CEO of Carpenter Morris Group, Serena Morris. Carpenter Morris Group is an independent TPA firm proudly providing retirement administrative services for over 45 years. Before Serena gets started, I just want to remind you that there is a Q&A section in the Zoom application. Please submit any questions and we'll address them at the end. The speakers will speak for about 45 minutes, and then at the end we'll have about 15 minutes for the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce you to Serena Morris.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time this morning with us. And I think that we have a lot to cover, but I'm hoping that it's going to be very informative for you in your practice. As Stephanie said, we are an independent third-party administrator. We are located in Longwood, Florida. And as a TPA, what we're responsible for is all of the compliance related to your retirement plan. We administer 401k plans, pension plans, ESOPs, cash balance plans, and so forth. And our role is really to complete the valuation at year end, do the 5500, do all of the testing, maintain your plan document, and basically just make sure that your plan stays in compliance. Today, we're going to be focusing on, however, the CARES Act and how that specifically affects your retirement plan. Next slide. So today what we're going to be discussing, here are the topics, terminated employees versus furloughed employees. You're going to see how these definitions are going to come up a couple of times in future slides. We're going to discuss how an employee can stop their employee deferral contributions. We're going to discuss suspending the employer safe harbor contributions, extension for defined benefit plan funding and freezing defined benefit plans, the new coronavirus-related distribution and loan options, suspending loan payments, required minimum distributions, and then pre-funding employer contributions for the PPP loan. Next slide. So let's get started with the definition of a terminated employee versus a furloughed employee. So a furloughed employee is probably something that you're used to possibly in, say, a government shutdown, where these IRS agents, let's say, are still considered employees, but they're on furlough during the government shutdown, but they are very much expected to return to work. The CARES Act does not provide any new definitions for what a furloughed employee is, so we're having to rely on prior guidance. But basically, a furloughed employee is typically an employee who's placed on furlough but is expected to return to employment at a later date. Typical language used by an employer during this type of arrangement would be, say, we are closing our doors until X date, May 15th. You are expected to return at that time. So there is an expectation that they are still your employee, but they are on a temporary leave of absence. Next slide. A terminated employee, however, it is a more clear, defined disconnect between the employer and the employee. Typically, the employee is now no longer considered to maintain a relationship with the employer. Typical language for this situation would be more along the lines of, we have to let you go. We don't know if we'll be able to hire you back. You can also look for signs of actual employment termination, such as they're now eligible for unemployment, you're no longer paying their health insurance, and there's no guarantee of rehire. Next slide. So why is this really important? Why do we care about how we define someone, whether they're terminated or furloughed? The reason this makes a difference, and probably the most important reason, is because it can affect the vesting schedule for the participant in the retirement plan. If more than 20% of your eligible participants are involuntarily terminated, this could trigger a partial termination of the plan. Now, don't let that word partial termination confuse you. It doesn't mean that your plan is now terminated. It's a term that we use that says we are now going to accelerate the vesting for these affected participants. So if more than 20% of your eligible participants are laid off or terminated during a 12-month period, we're required to fully vest them upon distribution. So let's say you had discretionary profit sharing or discretionary match, and normally you have a 6-year vesting schedule, and this participant has only been with you for 2 years. If they are part of a more than 20% layoff or termination, when we go to process their distribution, they are accelerated to 100% vested. Let me define for you what the IRS says is an affected employee. An affected employee in a partial termination is generally anyone who left employment involuntarily for any reason during the plan year in which the partial termination occurred and who still has an account balance under the plan. And for example, I'm laying you off because of the virus is still employer initiated. So the important piece here is involuntarily terminated. If somebody quits on their own accord for any reason, even if it's they quit because they don't feel safe coming to the office any longer, but you are still in operation, you're not terminating them, they would not be part of this count. Also, a furloughed employee is not considered terminated because remember, there's an expectation that they are coming back. So there is not a change in their employment, they're just on a temporary leave of absence. They would not be considered part of that 20% calculation. Next slide. Now we're going to move into, and you're going to see the terminated and furloughed definitions show up again. We're going to move into stopping the employee deferral contributions. I've had a lot of clients reach out to us to ask us, how can my employees stop during this period their personal 401k deferral contributions? So let's first take an active employee. This is somebody who's still working. However, for whatever reasons, personal reasons, they want to stop their personal employee deferral election. The law allows them to do that at any time by just completing a new salary reduction agreement. Even if your plan limits how often a participant can change their deferral percentage, the law says anytime a participant wants to go to 0, they can do that at any time. Now, if they're wanting to change it from 1% to 2% or down from 5% to 4%, they may have to wait according to your plan document when they're allowed to do that. But going to 0, the law requires that you have to allow them to do that at any time, and all they basically need to do is to complete a new salary reduction agreement and notify payroll, and then that would go in effect as soon as administratively possible once payroll receives it. Now, if an employee is furloughed without pay, obviously they're not going to be receiving compensation during that period, and so as there is no payroll to withhold those deferrals, the deferrals will stop automatically. However, when they are returning to work, they would not need to complete a new salary reduction agreement. The one that you had on file before the furlough started, you would immediately go back to upon their return to work and start withholding based upon their original salary reduction agreement, unless they come to you and they complete a new one at that time. A terminated participant is a little bit different though. They have truly stopped their relationship with the employer. Upon rehire, they are immediately eligible to start contributing. And this is a pretty common question, even before everything happened with coronavirus and with CARES, that if you had somebody terminate employment and then they were rehired, would they have to complete the service agreement again? If they were an eligible participant before they terminated, which means they met the age and service requirement to enter the plan before they terminated, they are eligible upon rehire to immediately go back into the plan upon their rehire date. However, you would need to have them fill out a new salary reduction agreement to have that on file to indicate the percentage they want to contribute. Next slide. So now let's talk about the employer portion. We were talking about the employees stopping their contributions, but let's talk about what flexibility we have for the employer for suspending the employer's safe harbor contributions. So you are allowed to stop the safe harbor match or the 3% non-elective, or even if you have a QACA, that's not in here, a qualified automatic contribution arrangement. You are allowed to stop the safe harbor contribution mid-year. However, there are some things that need to be discussed here, and you're going to see that it is very important before you make a change to remove the safe harbor feature from your plan that you have a pretty detailed conversation with your TPA. If you contact your TPA and you say that you want to stop the safe harbor and they don't have a lengthy conversation with you, you should be a bit concerned because there is a lot involved here and there could be some surprises down the road if you're not really carefully analyzing this before you take out the safe harbor. The first thing to know is that in order to do it, you have to provide a 30-day participant notice. So let's say you have the safe harbor match in place. You have to provide a notice to your participants that you will be stopping the safe harbor match 30 days from now. So today being May 7th, if I handed out the notice today, the earliest that I could stop the safe harbor match would be June 7th. And the employer is required to still match any deferrals from January 1 through June 7th. So you can't just stop now. You have to give them the 30 days and then contribute through that period. It would require a formal amendment to remove the safe harbor contribution, an amendment to your plan document. And potentially, if you decided to add the safe harbor back for plan year 2021, you would have to amend by December 1 of this year to add it back for 2021. All of those are pretty doable. A notice, the contribution during the period, the amendment. Where it gets a bit more complicated is the testing side. So when you have a safe harbor plan, you're not usually worried about something that we call ADP or ACP testing. What that stands for is average deferral percentage testing or average contribution percentage testing. What all that basically means is that when you are no longer a safe harbor plan, and by removing the safe harbor contribution, you are no longer a safe harbor plan for that plan year, when you are no longer a safe harbor plan, you have to do this testing. How much the highly compensated individuals, which are our owners, our employees that make $125,000 or more a year, so our owners and our highly compensated, how much they are allowed to contribute to the plan of their own personal 401k deferrals is now going to be dictated by how much the rest of the non-highly compensated employees contributed during the year. In a safe harbor plan, you don't have to worry about that. When you take out the safe harbor, let's say that your staff contributes on average 3% of their pay. The law says that the owners or the highly compensated cannot contribute more than 2 percentage points higher than the average of the staff. So if the staff is at 3%, now our doctor, our owner, is only allowed to contribute 5% of pay. And let's just say for easy math that you pay yourself $100,000 in W-2 as an owner, and I'm telling you that you can only contribute 5%. 5% of $100,000 is only a $5,000 401k deferral contribution. The IRS limit is $19,500 if you're under age 50, $26,000 if you're age 50 or older. So even though the IRS says that you can contribute $19,500, we do all of this testing after the end of 12/31/20 because you removed the safe harbor and you contributed more. In my example, it depends on what your staff does, but in my example, you contributed more than $5,000. That money is now going to have to be refunded out of the plan. And you don't get into trouble, and there are no IRS penalties or anything like that, but the issue is that the plan no longer really worked well for you this year. And that may be okay. You may be in a situation where you're not planning on contributing anymore this year anyway, but you should be aware of that. You don't want a situation, I hate it when clients are not aware of something that's going to happen. So when you take out the safe harbor, this additional testing could happen. You could have money refunded back out of the plan. Even more important than the refunds, because again, there's no penalties there, that's just money coming out of the plan. The most important decision you have to focus on when you're removing a safe harbor contribution is whether or not your plan is top heavy. Top heavy basically means that more than 60% of all the plan assets in the plan belong to what we call the key employees. So take a look at your entire plan. And let's look and see if more than 60% belong basically to the owners. A key employee is a more than 5% owner. It also includes officers and so forth. But basically we're looking at is more than 60% belonging to these key employees. If it is, then your plan is considered top heavy. Why that is important is because when your plan was safe harbor, you did not have to worry about top heavy. But when you pull the safe harbor out, you now have to contribute a top-heavy minimum to your staff. Can you all still see my screen? I think it's coming back here. Nope, we'll have to go back one slide. Go back one more, I think here. Sorry about that, guys. Can you go back, Stephanie, to the prior slide about suspending safe harbor? There we go. Thank you. It's coming. So if your plan is top heavy and you remove the safe harbor, since we're already in May, if your plan's top heavy and a key employee has already contributed in 2020, which is very likely that as an owner you've already put in deferrals for yourself, you could trigger a mandatory 3% top heavy contribution for all eligible participants. Now, why that's important is because let's say you had the safe harbor match in place. The match only goes to those that actually contribute. You remove the safe harbor match because you're trying to provide flexibility and reduce your obligation, but your plan is now top heavy and you now have to go and give a 3% contribution to all eligible participants, even if they are not deferring. That 3% top heavy could actually be much more expensive than what the safe harbor match would have been. So my cautionary tale here is do not remove the safe harbor unless you've had a conversation with your TPA and they've reviewed all of these things with you. Also, it cannot be added back during the plan year once it's removed. So if you suspend it now in 2020, you are locked into that for 2020. It cannot be added back until 2021. Next slide. Now let's talk about defined benefit plans. So the CARES Act did extend any contributions that are required for the 2019 plan year, which is normally due, we're talking about a calendar year defined benefit plan, extended the deadline from, which is normally September 15th of 2020 to January 1 of 2021. However, there's something for you to consider here because it's not quite that clear cut. First thing is that if you don't make your deposit by 9/15, there will be additional interest that has to be calculated from September 16th through when you actually do make the deposit. So for example, if your minimum funding to your defined benefit plan or cash balance plan, same thing, was $100,000 and you don't deposit it until January 1, you may have to deposit $103,000. There may be additional interest that is now going to be required. I think the most important piece here, and I want you to know that this is something that is very fluid right now. There's a lot of people talking about this and different opinions and interpretation of the IRS guidance, but it is believed right now that any amount deposited after September 15th is not going to be deductible on your 2019 tax return. So that's a big deal. You wait until January to deposit your $100,000 minimum funding, but now you can't take that as a deduction on your 2019 tax return. Again, this is something that I strongly recommend that you speak to your CPA about this. I have heard different opinions from different CPAs. I've also heard different opinions from different ERISA attorneys. So I think right now it's a bit early. Everyone's trying to get their arms around this, but that's very important. If you're going to lose your deductibility for your 2019 tax return, you may want to try to make this deposit by September 15th, even though you do have the extension. If you do not fund by 9/15, typically there's a 10% excise tax on any amount not funded. The CARES Act did waive that. So you don't have any excise tax for not funding, but I think the bigger issue is the deductibility and the additional interest. Next slide. This is another big question that you should be going over with your TPA if you have a defined benefit plan. When this all first started in March, we immediately reached out to every one of our clients that maintained a cash balance plan or a defined benefit plan to ask them if they wanted to freeze their defined benefit plan for 2020. Why this is important is because the benefit in 2019 was already accrued. They were going to have to fund that. We're already in 2020. There's nothing we can do about 19. We have to fund that. However, for clients that already could tell that they were going to be in a situation where it was going to be difficult to fund 2020, we needed to put some things in place now to give them that flexibility. Once a participant accrues 1,000 hours in 2020, which basically is 40 hours a week, by June, somebody would complete 1,000 hours, they're going to be locked into the minimum funding for the defined benefit plan for 2020. If there's any doubt about the ability to make your full contribution for 2020, freezing the plan now will provide flexibility to reduce that 2020 contribution. But you have to do it now. We have to amend the plan, we have to give a notice, and we have to do that 15 days prior to anyone completing 1,000 hours. This is really sort of a no-brainer. If you have any doubts, if you've seen a drop in revenue, if you're wanting some flexibility, there is really no reason to not freeze. And the reason why is if we get past all of this and we're in November and things are going to be okay, you can always unfreeze the plan. But if you fail to freeze the plan, you're basically going to be locked into what your minimum funding is, and there's not a whole lot you can do. Again, this freeze does not affect 2019. That's already been accrued, but it will give you some flexibility in 2020. The 2020 contributions are due September 15th of 2021. So for a lot of you, you may be thinking, well, that's way down the road. I don't have to worry about it. But if you can kind of see where things are going and you're thinking, I'd like to have that flexibility and not have to have this large contribution, then you should speak to your TPA now about going ahead and freezing the plan. Next slide. Can you go ahead and go to the next one? Thank you. Okay, so the next slide here is related to coronavirus-related distributions, or what we call CRDs. So these are the new distribution provisions that the CARES Act opened up for qualified individuals. And you're going to see that term qualified individuals a lot here. The CARES Act allows now up to $100,000 from a retirement plan for active employees, furloughed employees, terminated employees. So those definitions don't matter here, but they have to be qualified individuals. And a qualified individual is defined as an actual participant in the plan who is diagnosed with COVID, a participant or a spouse or a dependent of a participant that is diagnosed with COVID-19. So this actually reaches out to the participant's family, if anyone in the family is diagnosed with COVID-19, or a participant who experiences adverse financial consequences as a result of being quarantined, furloughed, laid off, having work hours reduced, being unable to work due to lack of childcare, closing and reducing hours of a business, basically due to COVID. So what's important to note here is that in this third bullet point, it does not talk about a spouse of a participant who experiences adverse financial consequences. We've gotten this a lot. Maybe you haven't had to furlough any of your employees, so the participants in your retirement plan are not experiencing adverse financial consequences, but their spouse has been laid off. Technically, that does not make them a qualified individual in your plan. Now, their spouse is a qualified individual in their 401k plan, but technically, their spouse would not create a qualified individual of your plan. But what's important to note here, and the IRS has been very, very clear about this, participants are required to self-certify that they are a qualified individual. And what that means is that plan administrators, meaning you, the owner, are not going to have to spend a lot of time getting documentation to support this financial need. They can self-certify, they can tell you that they are a qualified individual, and you can rely upon that. Next slide. Okay. We have the 10% penalty is going to be waived in a CRD. The participant has the option of waiving the 20% withholding. They have the option of paying that related income tax on the distribution over a 3-year period, and participants will be allowed to repay that amount to the plan tax-free over the next 3 years. These repayments are not part of the annual contribution limit. It'll be interesting to see how the record keepers actually accept these types of contributions in the future, but it is allowable over 3 years to be repaid back. Due to time, I'm just going to say this quickly here. You do not have to have an in-service withdrawal feature in your plan to allow for this. An amendment will be available at a later date, but you can go ahead and allow the CRDs at this time. Next slide. This is about qualified coronavirus-related loans. Basically, the takeaway from this is that they need to be an active or furloughed individual to do this. It has doubled the limit from 50% of their vested account balance, or $50,000, to 100% of their vested account balance, or $100,000. Note that terminated participants would not be eligible for this because they really don't have a mechanism to pay this back through payroll, but they could take a CRD. Next slide. You may choose to allow for these CRLs, even if your plan doesn't currently have this provision. It is thought that you may have to amend your plan by December 31st, but we are waiting further guidance on this. A participant with an outstanding balance will have this amount subtracted from their $100,000 limit. What that basically means is that if you already had an outstanding balance of $40,000 on another loan previously, the most you could take would be $60,000. So it does go into that calculation. CRLs are only available until September 23rd, and then that will sunset. Next slide. Suspension of loan payments. What's important about this is that qualified individuals can delay their payments from March 27th through December 31st, but regular payments will be required to resume January 1. So a lot of people are talking about the 1-year extension. It's really not truly a 1-year extension. The loan will go into default if you do not resume payments January 1 at the end of that quarter, March 31st. So that's where that 1-year extension is coming from, but really you need to start payments by January 1. Next slide. And for those people that had loans that had nothing to do with the coronavirus, they just had an outstanding loan prior to all of this going down, you may delay loan payments until July 15th, but then the loan will go into default if required payments are not made by 12/31. So you really only have an extension between 4/1 and 7/15. You don't have a full year. Next slide. Required minimum distributions, you all have probably heard a lot about this, so I'm going to go through this quickly. Basically, it just means that for 2020, There are no required minimum distributions unless you choose to take one. You would need to notify your TPA if you would like to take a required minimum distribution, but it is waived. The requirement is not there. You can skip it for 2020 and start again in 2021 if you choose. Next slide. And these last couple slides here I want to talk about with the PPP forgiveness. So the Paycheck Protection Program provides for a potential forgiveness of employer contributions incurred and funded during the covered period. So this would be 2 months from receiving the loan, set to expire June 30th unless they extend that. So this is talking about you receive your funds and now you want to fund a portion of your employer contribution to your retirement plan so that it may be forgiven. What would this include? It would be your employer contributions, safe harbor contributions, discretionary match, profit sharing, cash balance contributions for the employees. The question here that is coming up a lot is what is the definition of incurred during the covered period? There's a lot of discussion about whether 2019 employer contributions that are being calculated right now and deposited right now in 2020 would be eligible for this. I have heard that the conservative approach is no, that this would really need to be 2020 contributions that are incurred in 2020 and then funded in 2020. You would need to discuss this with your CPA to really get your arms around it. I know a lot of CPAs are spending time right now trying to figure that out as well. Next slide. And so what does this not include? You cannot pre-fund match before deferrals are made. So if you're trying to fund this in the 8-week period, once you receive the loan, you can't deposit in May for all of May and all of June's match because the deferrals have not yet been withheld. So you would have to do it every pay period. You can't fund the match before the deferrals have even been made. It is also not currently believed that the PPP forgiveness is going to apply to the owners or the partner's share of the employer company contribution. So your portion of the cash balance, your portion of the safe harbor, your portion of the match. The interpretation is that this should only be for the employees. Non-payroll costs, as you know, with the PPP loan can exceed 25% of the loans. You're going to want to make sure that anything that you're contributing above and beyond to the retirement plan is not going to exceed 25% of that loan. It is thought that you may not be able to forgive the entire year's worth of contributions, even if deposited during the covered period. It may be limited to 2 months of the calculated contribution. What that means is that some people are trying to fund right now maybe 6 months of 2020 in that 2-month period for that 8 weeks, trying to get all of that forgiven. There is thought right now that that will not work. That will only be forgiven would basically be 2/12 of the contribution, so 2 months of that annual contribution would be forgiven. A lot of this stuff is still sort of up in the air. I'm obviously not an SBA agent. But some of the brightest minds are still trying to get their arms around this of what's going to be forgiven and what's not. But the conservative approach right now is that more than likely only 2 months of your employer contribution would be forgiven. And then this last point I think is important. The IRS has said that if you use the PPP funds to make this deposit, those 2 months worth would not also be eligible for deduction on your tax return. So it makes sense that you're using the government money to make the deposit. You can't then also claim that as a tax deduction on your tax return. So of course the other 10 months would still be deductible, but the 2 months would not. Due to time, I think I'll stop there and I can answer some questions at the very end as well, and we can cover some more if we have additional time.
Thank you, Serena. Yes, if you do have questions, please go ahead and submit them via the Q&A section up at the top or in your toolbar. And also you'll see Serena's contact information up on the slide right now. If you want to reach out to her directly, you will also be receiving a copy of this presentation in an email after the presentation. I'd like to quickly move on to introduce you to Frank Garcia. Frank is a co-chief investment officer and wealth advisor at Resource Consulting Group. Resource Consulting Group is a fee-only independent investment advisory firm managing approximately $1.8 billion. Frank, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction, and thank you very much, Serena, for the summary of how the CARES Act really impacts plan funding and the logistical side of it. And I can't stress enough for the individuals on the call how important it is to partner with a TPA firm like Carpenter Morse, who is very proactive in assisting with those decisions that she talked about. And moving towards the presentation I have prepared for you today, this is going to be much more focused on the market itself and what has transpired really during 2020 and what we would expect to possibly see moving forward. So the first slide that we have up here is an illustration of the growth of a $1 investment in the S&P 500 as of the beginning of the year through the end of April. And what should come as no surprise to anybody is that sharp downturn that we had really from the end of February through the end of March, which if you see there, it dropped from $1 to 70 cents. That's about a 30% decrease during the year itself. One thing that we have had some clients and contacts reach out to us in regards to is what happened after that March 23rd bottom day, which is the subsequent recovery, which was quite significant. As you see, a dollar invested in the S&P 500 now would be worth roughly 92 cents. So it was about a 25% rally off the bottom. And the reason that that's so surprising, at least to most individuals, is just today, unemployment numbers were released. And in the last 7 weeks alone, 33 million Americans have filed for unemployment benefits. So there's a little bit of a disconnect, it seems like, between what's going on in the equity markets when compared to what's going on Main Street with individuals who are currently employed or going through unemployment issues as this pandemic has continued. One thing I'll point out here is the unemployment report that came out today. 3 million people filed for unemployment benefits in the last week. That is the lowest absolute number since the start of this pandemic in early March. So once again, that's part of the trend that has started to get less bad, even though 3 million is still an extraordinarily large number. And the equity markets and stocks in particular are forward-looking, meaning to expect and project what will be the economic circumstances 6 to 12 months from now. So in downturns such as what we've experienced thus far, the market does tend to recover before things start to get better in the general economy itself. So could we possibly revisit those lows that we saw in March? Absolutely. Short term, it's very difficult to anticipate or predict what the market's going to do. As we start to move away from the bottom and towards a recovery, if you could go to the next slide, please. It does become a little bit clearer in regards to what happens to the market coming off of downturn. So what we're looking at on this slide is what has been the performance of the US market itself. This is going from 1926 through December of 2019, following certain levels of market downturns that have occurred in that time frame. So if we start on the far right-hand side here, you'll see a 14%, a 16%, and a 50%. And the reason I'm going to start there is this is what happens to the market after a 30% market decline, which is, once again, what we just saw thus far in 2020. So 1 year out from those declines of the magnitude we just had, markets tend to be positive, 14% positive return. Over the 3-year period, you're looking at a 16% positive. Once you get out to 5 years, though, you'll see there's roughly a 50% increase in values there. And once again, that's off of a 30% decline. So in that 5-year period, the stock market tends to recover all of that downturn and then some, which is part of why it's so difficult to time what's going to happen to the markets short term. However, long term, markets work. And even when downturns are less significant than what we just had, such as the middle column here, 20% downturns, or that first column, 10% downturns, you see a fairly consistent narrative, which is that markets work. They just don't work all the time, meaning that you're going to suffer downturns. That's part of the process for earning the excess returns that we do in the market. And if you could go to the next slide, what this illustrates is, historically speaking, from 73 to 2019, when has the economic contraction happened, when have expansions happened, and what has the stock market done during those time frames. So this is no longer just looking at that 5-year period after a downturn, but really zooming out and looking at what's happened over time from 1970 through 2019. And a couple of takeaways I'd look at on this chart. One of which is if you invested $1 in 1973, that dollar would have grown to $108 as of the end of 2019. Definitely a trend up and to the right, but there's definitely some peaks and valleys that this chart illustrates. Even 2008, which is the second farthest to the left yellow, was a 50% decline. However, since that time, we have recovered and then some from that point. So the reason this is so important to take a look at and to consider is from our standpoint as an investment advisor for both our individual clients and our plan participants, the pain of the downturn is much more severe than the joy of the upturn when it comes. So having an investment advisor that works with you personally or in your plan that can help explain what these downturns and subsequent recoveries look like can help prevent participants from making detrimental decisions in the midst of the downturn, which is when most folks look at their 401k more often. And there's no question that when you're in the middle of what we've been going through in 2020, it's quite painful. Balance is decreasing. However, long-term and big picture, we believe free markets work, and there is a benefit for taking the risk that you're taking in regards to the marketplace itself. The next slide is the one that really talks about one of the most important decisions that individuals and participants really have to make when they are investing within the market itself. And that is a decision of how aggressive you would like to be. So if we start on the far left-hand side, and then we follow this to the far right-hand side, the dark blue line, and this is 2000 to 2019, so just the last 20 years, is the most aggressive of the allocations that we're looking at here. When you're more aggressive, you tend to have more volatility, meaning more price swings. So you'll see in the 2008, 2009 downturn, portfolio one, which is 100% stocks, had the lowest return at that time. However, coming out of that downturn and throughout the subsequent recovery, it ended up being the highest value at the end of 2019 compared to the other examples that are listed here. So one thing I'll point out is the last 20 years, returns have actually been quite low compared to historical averages, with a 6% return on 100% stock portfolio, whereas the expectation there is much higher. However, the relationship still holds. The more aggressive you were, the higher return you had. You also had, once again, higher volatility. So within 401k plans, participant directed that is, some of you on the call may have what are called pooled 401k plans. On the pooled 401k plans or cash balance plans, you pick your allocation and stick with it, and all participants are subject to that same decision that you've made. When it's a participant directed plan, usually there's two options within plans. One of the more popular that we see nowadays is the target retirement date funds. And those are fantastic for participants who want to set it and forget it and not have to worry about allocation over time. Those particular funds tend to be more aggressive as participants are further away from whatever that target retirement year is, be it 2050, 2040, whatever may be listed. And they get more conservative as that individual approaches retirement, which really helps take this very tough decision we're looking at right here off the table and makes it for them, which once again, with any of these 401k plans or investment plans, generally speaking, the more you can leave it alone, the better off you'll be, even if you have that pain, once again, going through the downturn. So, I'd highly recommend, if you go to the next page, please, making sure that the investment advisor that you're working with on your plan provides education to plan participants and talks through these decisions, specifically talking through the decisions that participants may want to make during a downturn, but would be terrible for them to make at this particular point in time. When we talk about the things Serena mentioned, a very important portion of what you're looking at with your retirement plans, and once again also translates over to the personal side, is the fees that you're paying. So, I would not be hesitant if I was anybody on this call to ask and inquire with your investment advisor for your plan for a list of the fees that you're actually paying and the performance of the funds within your retirement plan, because those two things are vital to determining how well you and your participants do over time with the investments. Third thing is any advisor that you utilize on the retirement plan side or individually, once again, should be alleviating stress for you and your participants. And they should give you contact information to share with your participants so that they have someone to speak with and to take some of that burden off of you as the plan trustee or as the CEO of the company itself. So make sure that you leverage that investment advisor who not only can help with the decision of allocation, but can also talk to your employees about the various options within the CARES Act, be it the distribution or the loan, and which one may or may not be best for participants in their particular situations. Last but not least, any investment advisor that you utilize on these plans should also be able to assist you, not just in seeing how your plan design and how your plan is performing, but also talking through what the plan means to you personally. So, I'd strongly recommend, if you don't have these conversations with your retirement plan advisor today, feel free to reach out to them. That's what they are compensated for, is providing this level of assistance. So I hope that you found at least this summary of the investment performance and what the role of an advisor is on a plan as worthwhile. If you could go to the next slide, please. One more, if you could. This is my contact information and the firm that I work with, Resource Consulting Group. We are happy to answer any questions or comments from any of you, either right now after this call or via email. If you have any questions about your plan or how the market how your plan, I should say, has performed given what the market has done. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our moderator.
Thank you, Frank. That was great information. I'll give a few minutes for people to submit their questions if they have anything for either Frank or Serena. While we're waiting for a few questions to come in, Serena, do you want to go back over that last slide that was skipped due to time?
Yes, absolutely, we can do that.
Great. Let's see if I can get back there real quick.